Playoff schedules that are going to dominate fantasy championships and help you win this season. It's only a couple of weeks away, Shawn. It's hard to believe. We're entering NFL Week 12. Some of the playoffs for people, depending on your format, if you're playing in the FFPC Main Event, will be starting next week. But obviously, if you're not, it'll be a couple of weeks down the line. You may have a window over the next week or so with trade deadlines coming up. The FFPC Dynasty trade deadline coming up this Sunday. But depending on your league's set up, maybe another week or so to play with. Some leagues, Shawn, I've always felt that I would like no trade deadlines. Let it run all the way up to the start of the playoffs. But when we look at some of the strength of schedules, maybe there's players who are performing on those teams, or maybe they aren't performing. There's a buy opportunity, but maybe you have had quite a cozy schedule so far, and maybe that means that your team may be in for a little bit of a tough run when it gets to the playoffs. All that and more we're going to work our way through as we approach NFL Week 12. Shawn, I'm mentioning in NFL Week 12, we're into mid-November at this point. Has it been a surprise as to how fast the season has kind of flown by? Sometimes I've felt that, seasons can drag a little bit where you're like, oh, this is pretty boring. But I did mention this at the start of the last show where I think there's been a lot more things to be excited about in the NFL this season.
Yeah, I guess I don't know. There have been a lot of really fun things. I certainly am grateful for all of the fantastic performances. Lots of highlights. We've had high-scoring games mixed in with the Sunday night slugfest. But I do think it's been emotionally fraught. You go through and you look at all your teams and you're thinking, well, so many of the players are hurt. How am I still in the mix in so many cases, even, in first in so many cases? And then you realize, well, everyone is dealing with the same thing. Everyone is dealing with injuries. And even though the injuries seem, very concentrated on not just the guys that we have, but some of the very top guys that we have, there have certainly been plenty of injuries to players that we don't have a lot of exposure to as well. And then when you think through the mix that everyone has, everyone is dealing with a similar type of thing. That doesn't necessarily make it less of an emotional battle, and the fatigue that you feel with the fatigue that you feel psychologically from dealing with that week in and week out, I don't think has made this feel like a blitzkrieg season by any stretch. It has been a fun one. It has been an interesting one. And it's one where I think there are lots of opportunities as we go into this dynasty trade deadline where you could still get some fun stuff done. There are so many guys hurt that if you have a rebuilding team, or if you have a team that isn't going to make the playoffs, even though, Colm, you and I have basically the two teams I have that are going to miss the playoffs, but both of them have rosters that are very fun. And it's not a rebuild, right? This is going to be a short-term reload. You expect to be competitive for the title next season. You can trade for injured players. You can trade for players who are disappointing. One of the things that I discussed in my article last week, which was on these 4 contrarian trade strategies, was this idea of buying on non-playoff teams. And I think that element of it is more viable maybe this year than it has ever been. You look at the teams that we have, and you look at the team that we have in the listener league, for example. We did trade our first, which has turned out to be a very poor decision. And yet we have multiple seconds, multiple thirds, multiple picks basically in every other round. And you're looking at some guys who might be acquirable for those picks. Would you prefer to have the veteran onto the roster next season? Maybe there's a case where you're going to move someone and fill in with another guy. So you help other managers accomplish their goals while you're building a stronger overall team. Now, the things that are kind of flipping through my mind, to put some actual player names to this, fit with the exercise today. You pull up the RotoViz streamer. We're still working with the one that hasn't been updated yet for the new week as we record on a Monday. But you have weeks 12 through 17. 2 of the 3 best schedules are the Philadelphia Eagles and the Minnesota Vikings. Colm, we have Aaron Jones on that team. We could afford to potentially move him to a playoff contender. Saquon Barkley is someone who is interesting from this perspective of buy guys who are older and disappointing. You'll get them for the toilet bowl version, or not the version, the toilet bowl contest that you have to win to get the top pick. We don't have our top pick, but we do want to win the 201. You think about guys who have been there in recent years, Bo Nix, Jackson Dart. You have the 201, you select one of those guys. It's almost as good as having the number 1 overall pick. Until the injury, Jackson Dart probably was the most valuable rookie from the 2025 class. And that's even with someone like Tetairoa McMillan, player we raved about in the first show of the week, being in that group. It's with Ashton Ginty having fantastic peripherals, even though he's forced to play for the Las Vegas Raiders. This dynamic where you could pick up someone like a Barkley, you could win the consolation tournament with him, and then you could deploy him in 2026, even though he's a year older at that point and coming off of a disappointing season. But Colm, the other thing that we were looking at here, and the reason that you work through the streamer and you get fired up about some of the potential here, is that Saquon Barkley, with the best remaining schedule, won't necessarily be coming off of a bad season when you look at the 2026 offseason. If he has a half season or a third of the season like what he had in 2024 to finish this year, he's going to go into 2026 as an asset on fire.
Yeah, it's interesting when we look at some of these players, because really what you're trying to do is buy players who either haven't fully hit their ceiling, or players who, like a Barkley, hit their ceiling, let's say last season, but it hasn't come through for them as of yet. I don't think there's a lot of difference overall in what Barkley's doing now versus last year, other than the end result, which obviously matters a massive amount. But I think the play ability is still there. I don't think he's like lost any of the ability that he had last season. So Shawn mentioned weeks 12 through 17. We've pulled up here in the RotoViz Strength of Schedule streaming app. There's a heat map version. You can go in for the overall version if you want to just do it there. But they get Dallas, Chicago, the Chargers, Las Vegas, Washington, and Buffalo through that run. And again, with Barkley being able to be, catching passes out of the backfield, some of those games like a Buffalo, if it went in a direction where we kind of talked about the Lions and the Eagles on the show on Monday and how that game played out. And I referenced that if that game played out, another 5 or 10 times, or if they met again in the playoffs, this could be based on the fourth down kind of variance of how those plays failed. And this one for the Lions could be a much different game. But the thing with Barkley, obviously, we know that he's kind of insulated to negative game scripts as well, that can get more in the passing game. I'm interested, Shawn, as we go down through these running back options, or the teams with the favorable running back schedules, if there's any other names standing out. You mentioned Aaron Jones. The Minnesota Vikings show up as the third highest overall rated team on this. The second highest is the New Orleans Saints. We did talk at the end of the last show about Travion Henderson, Shawn, and Ramondre Stevenson will come back into the mix here, and it's going to be hard to buy in and get somebody to trade you Henderson. But maybe you're just listening to this as a Henderson manager and you're like, well, this is going to get me excited. They do have a bye week in week 14, but they are the fourth highest rated. They get Cincinnati Bengals, the New York Giants, the Buffalo Bills, the Baltimore Ravens, the New York Jets. So they're set up well. Washington, fifth highest. Arizona then comes in, then the Rams, then the Chiefs. We know that they have no running back, so it doesn't really matter. And then Carolina, followed by Miami. Is there any team, Shawn, out of that list, or maybe even further down, that are piquing your interest as to potentially acquirable players? It's interesting with the likes even of an Achan, who has had a couple of really, really impressive, like high scoring games, but then there's some of these weeks where it's like just a fine score where people maybe aren't getting the number that they're hoping for. Maybe you could tempt somebody away with somebody like that. But is there any names standing out for you at the running back position to go and acquire? I know the Washington game this week with, Krosky Merritt threw up another couple of questions around how that Washington backfield will be deployed moving forward.
I think you always want to be open to moves that are going to make your team deeper and younger, as you want to maintain similar talent levels and create more paths. So you ask, what will you do with Achan? To acquire Achan, you'd have to spend pretty big, right? But maybe with the injury situation surrounding the Atlanta Falcons, you would move a Bijan Robinson, you would get back Achan plus. And the plus would probably still need to be something pretty significant, even though Achane himself is that good. But you think about who is poised to score more points the rest of the way. Now, partly when we think about the Falcons situation and potentially not having a Drake London, you're thinking about even more targets to Bijan Robinson. So the offense being less functional doesn't necessarily mean that he scores fewer fantasy points, but it does close down some of the pathways for him, and that these touchdowns that he and Tyler Algier have been scoring recently, those might be a little bit harder to come by. Certainly, though, if you are moving a Bijan, and he's one of the several, thankfully, foundation pieces that Monty and Bjorn have on the teams that we co-manage together, maybe you would think about moving a Bijan and picking up Achane. Maybe you would think about moving a Jonathan Taylor, right? Because at this point, you can move Taylor at the absolute apex of his value. You can assume that Daniel Jones gets a couple of these sneak touchdowns as we're going forward. You can assume that Taylor doesn't continue to break off the same types of runs. Now, I do think there's a little bit of a difference in season to across seasons. It's not as surprising that Barkley's 2024 would somewhat come out of nowhere, where he wasn't particularly good in 2023. He proved everyone wrong in 2024 and has all these long runs. He's come out in 2025. And I guess I would say that I do think he's been substantively different, even as mostly what we're missing are just the long runs, right? And even things like, look, he's ruled down at the 1-inch line in the game on Sunday night. And then obviously you lose that touchdown to the sneak. Taylor, within the context of this season, is more likely to stay hot than if you're saying, oh, like Taylor in 2026, would he reasonably be the Saquon Barkley type of path? Now, to some people, this is going to sound a little bit either revisionist or focusing not exclusively, but maybe a bit too much on the most recent results. But I do think that Jonathan Taylor is actually slightly different than Saquon Barkley in that he doesn't necessarily have the same lateral explosiveness, and he's not as intuitive a receiver, but he is a better pure runner. And I do think that some of the things that Jonathan Taylor does, he can extend in a way that was going to just simply be difficult, if not impossible, for a Saquon Barkley. But it's easy to say that when a guy is as hot as Taylor is now. Even Barkley skeptics would not have thought that he was going to have a season like 2025 is. If you move a Jonathan Taylor, who, again, fitting in with our current theme, has a neutral schedule, but certainly over the next 3 weeks has a relatively difficult schedule, right? The Chiefs could slow you down. The Houston Texans can slow you down. The Jacksonville Jaguars have been very feisty on defense at times this season. 3 weeks from now, we could be looking at this completely differently, but the trade deadline will have passed. Let's say you move a Jonathan Taylor for Devon Achane. Again, plus you have Achane, who in many ways is Jahmyr Gibbs, just slightly less, certainly in an offense that you can be less confident of. It's that offensive context for Achane that makes it even this question of, say, trading him and getting a substantial piece in addition, because otherwise we would just have Achane as a player in this group where if he's going to have this kind of schedule to finish, you're like, just acquire him straight up. Fortunately, we're in a situation where you should be able to get other meaningful pieces on top if you make the type of blockbuster, high-stakes, controversial trade that we're discussing here.
I'm going to jump into tight ends next, Shawn, because I think there's a couple of teams here where either tight ends are on the roster, but they're fading names, the likes of the Baltimore Ravens. Another team that there really is not much at tight end, as much as I have wanted for many years. Greg Dulcich to be a thing, Miami Dolphins. Then we get the Arizona Cardinals, who you cannot really go and acquire Trey McBride, but it's fantastic to see that he is the third ranked overall schedule the rest of the way. The Colts with Tyler Warren, who you're not going to be able to really acquire either. You get the Atlanta Falcons. We talked on Monday's show about Kyle Pitts a little bit. He's in there. Carolina Panthers kind of spread around the tight end room. And obviously Jatavion Sanders is the one that I like, but it hasn't been focused on him. Detroit have lost Sam Laporta for at least 4 weeks, and we'll see what comes back behind that. And then we get the New England Patriots with Hunter Henry in there. But even while they factor in high up the list at that particular point, it isn't that much of a favorable set of fixtures for them. They do have the New York Giants. They get a bye. They get the Buffalo Bills. They get the Baltimore Ravens. New York, Buffalo, and Baltimore, not that favorable of matchups. They do get Cincinnati this week coming, which is very favorable to tight ends, which boosts them up a little bit. With the Baltimore Ravens this week, like Mark Andrews has felt like he's way beyond his best for really since he picked up that injury last season. But he goes 3 for 32 on 5 targets, but he also scores his first rushing touchdown of his career, Shawn, on a kind of tush-push sneak situation where he bootlegs out and rushes for a 35-yard touchdown. So, maybe he factors in Isaiah Likely's there too. They have tight ends that have had talent and had big games in the past. But it's kind of a mixture of the teams that have really elite tight ends that you can't target, and then the tight ends with question marks. Is there any of them teams like Baltimore, Atlanta, or Carolina where you're like, the question marks here are worth having one of these guys on your roster when it comes to the playoffs? Because I mentioned New York getting Cincinnati, the New England Patriots getting Cincinnati this week and not being favorable. Baltimore gets Cincinnati in week 13 and week 15, which is very favorable.
It is favorable. You think about where the Ravens are right now and how bad they looked in that game against the Cleveland Browns. I think it's probably 50-50 who wins that game if Dylan Gabriel doesn't get pushed out. And it wasn't because of anything Dylan Gabriel was doing. It's just the massive gap still between where Gabriel is and where Sanders is. And in fairness, even though Gabriel's probably the better guy, he's also gotten to play some. Right, it's difficult for Sanders to be pressed into that situation. He did look the same that he looked in the preseason when he had a chance. That more or less takes you out of any opportunity to win, even when Myles Garrett is completely destroying the Baltimore Ravens offense. And
Myles Garrett, Shawn, we don't talk about defensive players. Myles Garrett is unbelievable. He is incredible. We sat the Browns defense this week because I was like, Lamar, it's going to be tough to get, pressure on him. He gets out of these sack situations. And it's like, Myles Garrett's like, yeah, I'm just going to sack him. It doesn't really matter.
Early in the season, there was a lot of focus on Micah Parsons. Obviously, he's been good, certainly in spurts. But it's been nothing like what Myles Garrett is currently doing there in Cleveland. You add in the wind, you add in the fact that they have the injury to Rashad Bateman, which has made their receiving core a little bit thinner. As you would expect, they're getting absolutely nothing from DeAndre Hopkins, who, after his performance with the Chiefs last year, certainly not a player that you want to include on your roster if you're serious about building out depth and pathways there. We don't really hear much from Devontae Walker in that game. So you're looking at Zay Flowers and not much else. I was optimistic that Isaiah Likely might be able to have a breakout season coming into the year. He's been a ghost. Now, we know that he came in with an injury, sort of a similar type of dynamic to Mark Andrews, where you're like, well, once he gets healthy, we'll start to see him play. But that's one of the problems with these players who are injured, is that even once they come back, you don't know how long it will be until you see the real version of themselves. And then for a player who hasn't fully ever broken out, it's hard to decide, well, is this the real guy? Is this injury related? What have you? My point here would be that even though Mark Andrews is clearly removed from his best, I don't know that he's as clearly removed from his best as Travis Kelce is. I mean, Travis Kelce is maybe the most washed up player in the league. If not for his name and his contract, Kelce would not be on this team. He certainly would be benched. And yet there are individual situations that come up, like the game in week 11, where the defense is saying, we'll take away Xavier Worthy, we'll take away Rashee Rice, we'll even put a little bit of effort into limiting Kareem Hunt. You can do whatever you want with Travis Kelce. And because the name still carries that element, and because you do still have that rapport, I don't know. I mean, I would far prefer to have Mark Andrews than Travis Kelce. To have Andrews with this schedule down the stretch, and to think that he almost certainly will be available everywhere because he is an aging veteran. That's the kind of guy where you acquire him, you try and win with him if your team is good. You try and take this period where he rehabs a little bit of a value if your team is bad. One of the things that I decided not to bog the article down with a lot was simply that, well, there's a big advantage to adding to your team in FFPC formats where the consolation is huge, right? Where you can win the 101 by being good. We've got a couple of teams that are good that are going to miss the playoffs. You're certainly thinking, how can we win the 101? Because now you rebuild and you reload so quickly. The other team, thankfully, we didn't trade our first round pick on. And yet this type of mentality works for other formats as well. And it certainly works if you're going to be out-tanked by other teams, right? If you currently have a good team that is going to miss the playoffs, you don't have a path to tank hard enough to get to the 101 or the 102. And even if you did that, you have other teams that are basically not starting any real players and are putting up 40, 50 points because I'm going to get the 101. That's my whole goal for this season. Like, I'm not going to score any points. I'm going to get the 101. Go ahead and start reloading your team right now as opposed to waiting for the offseason. And you can even do that in some contrarian ways by taking the players off of these teams that are saying, we're going to out-tank you. We're going to be the 101. We're going to be the 102. Grab some of their players at a discount right now and simply be in better shape to make your push again next season. Whether you're in a format that has a consolation tournament or not, you can buy as a team that misses the playoffs. You just want to be very aware of schedule. You want to be very aware of price, and you want to always be adding to the overall value of your roster.
And the other one I am going to reference is Kyle Pitts. It gets the Jets, the Seahawks, Tampa Bay, and then Arizona. And Arizona is a tougher matchup to tight ends, but in general, they're free flowing when it's giving up points before they face the Rams in week 17. Again, when we're looking at tight ends to acquire, you would be acquiring a younger player in that situation. You may also factor in that Drake London may miss some time in this, so there may be a wider opportunity. And then there's a quarterback change, most likely with the Kirk Cousins stepping in for Michael Penix. So in that situation, if you're like, could have Mark Andrews, could have Kyle Pitts for this playoff stretch, and then looking ahead to beyond that time, or are we done? Are we done with Mr. Pitts?
There's just such an extensive body of work at this point for Pitts that suggests that, Pitts is basically Noah Fant, right? And Noah Fant was an extremely potent athlete. He was a high pick. He didn't ever have that first season that Pitts had. And yet these guys are on the same career trajectory. Fant has been decent this season, right? He's someone who is a mild plus for the Bengals. So I don't think that we're talking about Pitts necessarily being out of the league, but I think that we have to look at him as a Noah Fant type of player. We're talking about multiple coordinators, multiple QBs. In a variety of contexts, he simply has not been able to do much at all. And that includes this season where, they're desperate for someone to draw a little bit of the attention from Drake London, obviously pre-injury. Colm, I wanted to throw one back to you here where teams have a lot of different situations they're facing down this final third of the fantasy portion of the NFL season. You mentioned that Trey McBride can't be acquired. He has the third most favorable schedule, and he is white hot now with Jacoby Brissett as QB. It's impossible not to notice and be a bit depressed by the player who ranks 32 in schedule. Are there team situations? Are there overall builds where you're thinking to yourself, Trey McBride is good. He may be better than Brock Bowers. He is obviously in a better immediate situation. And yet Brock Bowers still has this potential to 15 years from now, not just being considered the best tight end of all time, but to have gapped everyone else and people writing him up as one of the best players in NFL history. Brock Bowers has the toughest remaining schedule. There have to be some Bowers teams. And frankly, I've got a lot of Bowers teams live in redraft. Those managers are not going to be happy that you have this tough schedule, because we did see recently in week 10 what can happen if the defense is able to, limit what Geno Smith and Chip Kelly are able to do. This can't make you happy. You've got matchups with teams like the Cleveland Browns we were just raving about, matchups with the Denver Broncos. We know how tough they are. Matchups with the Philadelphia Eagles, who just did what they did to the Detroit Lions. Matchups with the Houston Texans, where say what you want for DeMeco Ryans and the Texans and all of the stuff going on there, but their defense, they rally to the ball and they hit you. Hard. Would you, as a Trey McBride manager, think like this is a chance to make a move where I pick up a guy who will eventually be the greatest tight end ever? Would you trade Trey McBride for Brock Bowers? Obviously not in redraft, but in a dynasty league right now.
It's something that's very interesting to consider. The one thing I do think about that is it's going to be very hard based on Shawn Siegele owning Brock Bowers in every single league available to get Brock Bowers off Shawn Siegele, but not just Shawn. I'm kind of joking there, but I do think a lot of people who have drafted him and have him on the roster now to move for a slight adjustment, unless you're offering something that's substantially worth them making that decision to change from McBride to Bowers, is going to be a little bit tricky to pull off. I also think with if you're trying to go from, this is the situation of going from McBride to Bowers, I don't think that enough in the dynasty format over the next 5 weeks to move based on just that reason. So I guess they're both going to be in the same tier in terms of the rankings, but I do think that you're going to have to pay more to get to Bowers, and that's just going to be quite the challenge, I think, coming into this stretch. The other thing I was going to say is with Bowers, it's not Bowers versus the defenders that worries me, and we're recording this prior to Monday Night Football. It's Geno and the offensive line versus these defenses is more of my concern moving forward. So sometimes you'll think, is this player going to be matchup proof? I think he's probably as close to that as possible, but it's as his offensive coordinator and his quarterback defense proof. That's the question. I guess I think that that's just something that's going to be very tough to pull off. I would rather have Brock Bowers moving forward on my roster, but I'm kind of struggling to figure out.
Let's look at it from the other direction then. I mean, if you have a team that, other than the disappointment of Bowers, has been the best team in the league, and you want to win this year without really curtailing your ability to win in the future, do you reach out to the Trey McBride manager knowing this information and say, look, I mean, do you want Bowers? What additional will you give me? I will take Trey McBride in this move. You can get Bowers, maybe the greatest tight end ever, and I'm not even going to ask for too much on top of Trey McBride, thinking that it dramatically increases your chances to win this year to have McBride, and that maybe there's just not that much difference, right? And that's one of the cases that I made before the season. So saying Bowers should be your number one ranked player. That obviously hasn't turned out with the injury situation. But even with that being said, there's not much of a gap. So if you're one of these managers who prefers Trey McBride, who prefers a slightly lesser expensive player, if you prefer in a non-premium league just to get that extra round and a half, maybe 2 round differences, because in some formats the tight ends are very devalued, just go with McBride, right? And now he's done what he's done. We talk about the situation here with Brissett, but the fact of the matter was that Trey McBride was also lighting the world on fire with Kyler Murray. I think it's easy to say, well, you can't put the genie back in the bottle with this Brissett production, but almost regardless of who you have at QB for the Cardinals, the offense is going to have a lot of these quick hitters to McBride that provide a fantastic floor to his production. And then anytime the QB is able to hit him in the end zone, anytime the QB is able to get him into these deep zones where he's in that gap, you're hitting him for 20, 25-yard gains, you're getting him in a situation where he can actually catch and run, all of things that Brissett has been able to do. Now you have someone who is essentially the same redraft value as a superstar back, a dynasty value above that. I guess my question would be, are we approaching the position where Trey McBride is a top 3 or 4 player in Dynasty Superflex to where almost anything that you could do to go out and get him with this closing schedule would be pretty justified?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that he has risen his case this season from being like an elite tight end to being an elite everything in terms of where you'd be ranking him, and particularly in tight end premium. I think that Brock Bowers has a case to be made for being up there at the 101, and then I think you have a case for the 104, 105 range in tight end premium to be. It's gonna be, I think, QB in most situations, but I could see people going that direction. The other thing is there's a 3-year age gap between them as well. So when you're looking at having Bowers as a future Hall of Famer, greatest tight end of all time at this particular point with a 3-year age gap, I would rather stay on that side if I'm on that side. But it's an interesting one to think through as you enter this place. I'd be interested if any of the listeners decide to make any moves like that. Let us know if it works out in terms of making a deal moving forward. Shawn, running or wide receivers is the last one to finish up on. Again, we're in that category of the teams that have the elite wide receivers going to be a little bit more harder to acquire. We have Detroit, we have San Francisco, Washington, the New York Giants, the Seattle Seahawks, Minnesota, Philadelphia, and Green Bay, along with Buffalo. And I do find it interesting, we've talked about the struggles off Green Bay and the receiving core, but maybe a Reed gets back and gets healthy, but Christian Watson has flashed a couple of times. Philadelphia, when the receivers are being used, obviously is very helpful. Now they do get Dallas in week 12, which kind of skews a little bit of this towards their favor. You and Ben talked about JJ McCarthy on the Steel and Bananas recap show this week. If he can get things together, it didn't sound very optimistic on the review of what happened on Sunday, but obviously that would bolster Addison and Jefferson. Very positive for JSN. Maybe Torrey Horton gets back in the mix there. Any of those teams with players you're either excited to see the schedule they have or think that people maybe should acquire the names on those rosters?
We received an interesting offer this week that you had messaged me about, saying you were pretty even on it if I wanted to go that direction. That was moving Jameson Williams and Chase Brown to acquire Garrett Wilson.
This was before the week's action, obviously, where we get the decent result from Jameson.
Yeah. And so I think anytime that you get a good result from the player involved, it is going to move the needle. It is a good reminder of how much vertical ability, speed, scoring potential long-term is embedded in that Jameson Williams profile. It's also just an example of the occasional one-off games that he has that you're going to get, but you're going to get some disappointments. Even with that being the case, I do still think I might even prefer Jameson Williams straight up at this point, simply because the situation with Garrett Wilson has been one of extreme inefficiency early in his career. We know so much of that is Zach Wilson based, but we're now in a timeline with him that is similar to, if not worse than, what we're dealing with the Minnesota Vikings receivers, where we just never know if Garrett Wilson is going to be able to do it. I think there's a little bit of a tendency to apologize for Wilson too, or to imagine a ceiling scenario for him if he hadn't been in such a terrible environment that might overstate what he could potentially do, even if things turn out in his favor. And I mentioned that obviously because Detroit has the number one remaining schedule. If you just live through the Amon-Ra St. Brown debacle, you're enthusiastic about that. You're thinking that's not going to happen too many more times. The Lions and Jared Goff are going to really get things going. And I do think that they will. But I think that Jameson Williams is going to be a big part of that, especially with the Sam Laporta injury. So I would be out there trying to acquire him. It is unfortunate that this comes right on the heels of that game, because that game will make it much more difficult to pry him away from the opposing manager. Probably easier to do something like trade for Ricky Pearsall after the
that's what I was thinking here. Yeah,
as the number 2 team here. The one that's interesting at number 5 with Seattle, Jackson Smith and Jigba, the season that he's having, that raises the question that we just discussed with Bowers and McBride of, would you move guys like a Justin Jefferson? Would you move someone like a Puka Nacua? Would you move someone like CD Lamb plus? Because you're going to have to pay more than CD Lamb at this point to get JSN. All of that is interesting within the context of the possibility that his season to this point is merely appetizer for what we eventually get, as they probably try and this is the debate where you throw the 4 interceptions. Do you look at that game and say, well, that's a reminder of why we want to run it? Or do you look at that game and say, we should be a little bit more aggressive because we have the best team in football, and if we can get Sam Darnold even a little bit more comfortable. Now, comfortable, you think, well, he's been almost spotless until that game, but you need to put more of the weight on him in order to force him to take responsibility for the team, to be able to shoulder that burden. Say, can you be efficient? Can you be spotless? Can you be explosive if we put more of the game on your shoulders? Can you develop that so that when you play teams in the playoffs like the Rams, you're ready for it, as opposed to continuing on with this approach that will beat, and in many cases, hammer the bad teams? The same questions that I have always about the Green Bay Packers and Jordan Love. Do we build out a strategy that makes you a Super Bowl contender, or do we stay with what we're doing? Now, the counter argument there would simply be the Philadelphia Eagles, who don't let Jalen Hurts do anything. When they do, he tends to look as bad as he looked against the Lions on Sunday night. So maybe that's not necessary. That's a long-winded way of saying I don't know that we're going to get the fireworks from the Seahawks, but the schedule is compelling. Colm, the Vikings here, after what we just saw from J.J. McCarthy, is there any part of knowing the schedule that makes you more enthusiastic for trying to get a Justin Jefferson, maybe to get the more acquirable player in a Jordan Addison, who's coming off of a couple games, really a stretch here with either a lot of targets or a lot of air yards or both, but very inefficient, has a couple of notable drops in the most recent game. That kind of thing is going to stick with people and change the perception of him a bit, maybe make him a bit more acquirable. Or the team right after them, the Philadelphia Eagles, you just have this game with Devontae Smith where he has not exactly a drop, but a missed opportunity early, and then ends up with the one catch, where all the enthusiasm building around him just circles the drain. Either of these two guys that you're thinking, maybe we can go out and make a move. And certainly the Falcons, the most difficult schedule, even say if we have Drake London healthy, London plus to try and acquire some of these guys.
The one thing about the Minnesota Vikings is I just don't feel like I'm in agreement with you and Ben. I don't feel like JJ McCarthy has shown us really anything to be overly optimistic about, and that there'll always be games where there'll be more efficiency or they'll hit on some of the big plays. Like the one thing with them at the moment is they are going for it, in terms of, I've done this thing all season about giving the playmakers chances to make plays. But the problem with it is every time he goes deep to Justin Jefferson, it's an interception. There was a couple of interceptions off the last couple of weeks where it's very good defensive plays, but there's other ones where there's times where like 2 defensive backs could have intercepted it if like either of them go for it. So I'm very, very concerned about how it will play out in the long term with JJ McCarthy. So I would like to get those guys. The one thing about if you get a Justin Jefferson or Addison, or even if you get a Devontae Smith, like they're going to hold value through the offseason, even if it doesn't work out for you this year. But in terms of acquiring them based on the strength of schedule, that wouldn't really be the direction that I would be pushing. And when I look at this list, Shawn, a player we did trade away who had a pretty good game this past week, we traded him away maybe 6-8 weeks ago, that we acquired in a different trade, then moved him on, was Deebo Samuel. Again, maybe a veteran presence that people, if they're not in a contending team, may be willing to move on because they get Minnesota, New York, Philadelphia, and then Dallas. The other team, though, that is here, Shawn, that is quite favorable, I think, and will be playing in negative game scripts for most of it. Maybe a Wendell Robinson for the New York Giants as they get Detroit, New England, bye week, Washington, Minnesota, Las Vegas. I think, again, a player who could be acquirable at that cost. I'm sure there's a lot of Ricky Pearsall managers out there who have been very frustrated this season. Doesn't do anything this week in his return, which will obviously be more frustrating for people could factor into that as well. But there's a couple of teams in there, even the Packers, who have referenced that where you could, and we haven't seen it with Golden at all, and we talked about this on the previous show, but again, maybe are able to acquire something at a lower cost. In terms of people wondering what the tougher schedules are, we get Atlanta, Jacksonville, Las Vegas, New England, Carolina, Tennessee, Arizona. So Ted McMillan, or Mr. McMillan as we are now calling him, may be affected by that schedule that they face off against here. But yeah, interesting to look ahead a couple of weeks down the line and see how the playoffs are going to shape up. But for people who maybe were frustrated with the Detroit Lions in week 11, to see them get Dallas, the Rams, Pittsburgh, and Minnesota over the last 4 weeks is bound to be very soothing on those pains of the weekend. But that's where we're going to finish up this edition of RotoViz Overtime. Hopefully you've enjoyed listening in. We did a Monday recap show. I would recommend to check that out if you haven't done so already. Shawn and Ben also did a Stealing Bananas episode where they talked through a lot of the games as well. So check that out over on the Stealing Bananas podcast feed. You can check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.